Hi, welcome to the Handyman Club video series. The table saw is the heart of any woodworking shop or construction site. We often cover table saw techniques and tips in American How-To magazine and in our book series, but there's only so much you can show on the printed page. That's why we've prepared this special video just for you. There's nothing like watching an expert use a tool and then trying to match his technique yourself. So we asked Life member Roger Cliff to show us some of his advanced table saw techniques.
One of the first things we're going to do today is make cove cuts and turn them into picture frames. I chose picture frames for a number of reasons, but the most important one is there are a lot of challenges and opportunities to learn woodworking in a very small object. The other neat thing about it is that there's always somebody that needs a picture frame. Generally they're very expensive, but they're inexpensive to make. We're going to focus now on making a compound mitered picture frame with a cove cut in it. I've drawn a cove on this piece of wood. The next thing I do is I set that cove over this set of parallels and I lock that at that width. I next put this over the saw blade and I have the saw disconnected from the power here, and I watch the blade, and what I want to do is make sure that one tooth at the table is touching each side of the parallels, because that tells me the angle at which the fence must be oriented to make this cut. I'm going to take a sliding T-bevel, and what I'm going to do is first lightly lock it so it's kind of stiff and it'll hold the setting so I can approximate this. I'll bring this over and I'll ease it up until I get that exact angle. Bring it back, lock it at that setting, check to make sure I'm on, and I'm now going to bring my board up like so. And there are a couple of considerations. First of all, the fence has to be at this angle. And second, that tooth at the table has to line itself up with the edge of that cove. So that's how the fence has positioned. We determine the angle with parallels, then we determine the starting point in our stock, and then we proceed to clamp this down. The cove is following along nicely here, and I'm going to have to make a series of cuts. It'll probably be 4 or 5 to complete the cove to the desired layout line. I prepared a sanding block, and you'll notice that it has the exact shape on here. I made that up with a auto body filler compound that you would use to patch a hole in a car. And what I did is I took a piece of molding and I capped the ends with little wooden caps such as you see here. I then filled it with the compound. After it cured, I sanded it off. Then I took one end off, and this will peel out of here. It just pops out. And then it can be glued to the bottom of a block so that you actually have a sanding block that fits that exact shape. Now, with this type of technique, you can match just about any molding there is. One last thing I want to show you. This cove is a very large cove. In other words, it was almost double in width. And what we did here is we actually we raised the blade into the wooden fence so that only 1/2 of the saw blade did the cutting, and then we actually made 1/2 of the cove. So you could actually use this as a tool to make up molding of this sort. The molding, I was quoted from a millwork shop, $8 a foot. The wood cost me $1 a foot, and I was able to do it myself. I made this cut in here with a molding head on the table saw, and that's what we're going to do next. What I have is what we call a molding head, and there are insert cutters. This is a cove insert cutter in here now, and we're going to use this to cut a cove. I set it for a relatively light cut for the species of wood I'm working with, and I'm comfortable with the amount that's being removed. A harder wood would require a lighter cut. I have 3 feather boards on here, one clamped to the table to push the stock in toward the fence. The fence in this case appears to be a piece of particle board, but it's been screwed to the actual metal fence and it's locked in position. These 2 feather boards are then clamped in place, so as I bring the piece of wood under here, you can see that they will hold the stock in a true orientation. Also, it's difficult to remove it because of the pressure of the feather boards. I also put a mark on here, again an arrow, and I'll put that against the fence as a reference. I am centered well here, but if there were just a slight difference, I would like to make sure that all my pieces were cut uniformly. That way I can flip them one way and be sure that they'll fit when I miter them or put them together in any molding application. So I'm set up for the cut. I'll be using a push stick to guide this through. The way these feather boards are positioned, I have adequate room to do so. Now, if you look at the quality of the molding, it's actually better than the original surface on the wood, which was done with a planer. So the cut quality is very good. The molding cutters are very sharp, and they're doing a good job. I want this just slightly larger, so I'm going to elevate the head just a little bit and make one more cut, remembering that I'm cutting the entire periphery of that cove again, so I'll be removing a lot of stock. Again, I've got my reference arrow, and I'll use that to help me out. What I've now done is put a wooden throat plate in, and I've got bead cutters in the molding head. This will make that small round in my stock, and that's what I'm trying to achieve, is this decorative look right here. So this piece will have one on each side of the cove, and we'll make that by making two separate cuts. Here's the regular metal throat plate that goes inside, and you notice the wooden one, being held in here by the fences and the featherboard, has a much smaller opening in it than this one does. This is very important if you're working with smaller stock, or if you're bringing that corner over. I don't want that corner to fall into that opening. So by making the opening as small as possible, I can reduce the likelihood of anything like that happening. So you'll find yourself making up wooden throat plates for various applications using molding heads, and I'd encourage you to make those up. It's just an investment in doing the job safely. I know a lot of the members have talked to me about this before, and they ask, is this the right way to go? And it is absolutely the safest way to make that opening as small as possible. So let's set these aside and go on with the cut. Okay, the top has been shaped, and this gives us a molding. You've seen a number of molding applications now. The next thing we have to do is cut the edges for rabbets, either at a 45 or flat. I've set my stacked dado head up on the table saw. I have the outer cutters and then enough chippers to make it a 5/8 inch width. I have a 3/4 inch piece of particle board screwed to the metal fence, and I'm going to move it into position in a minute. But what I want to first point out is this pencil line 3/8 up from the table. I'm going to be doing a 3/8 inch deep rabbet on my frame stock, so that's going to be the mark that I'll be using. Now, to remove that stock, I first have to drop the dado head beneath the table, and then I bring this over. I'm going to look down, and as long as I can see that last cutter, which is an 1/8 inch thick, I know that I've got 2/8 or a 1/4 inch to spare that won't be cut away. So now that I've set that up, I'm going to turn on the saw and slowly raise it up till it cuts that line, and then I'll back it off just a little bit. That will give me my 3/8 height, and then all I have to do is set the width, and I'll show you that as soon as we get that cut. All right, I've wasted that away, so now I know that my dado head is going to be 3/8 by half, and I think I've marked it on one of my pieces of stock here. So now all I have to do is position it like so. Okay, so now I know that that's the cut that I'll make. But to make this a little safer, let's add a couple precautionary devices. First, a feather board, and this is a little different than what you've seen. This goes in the slot on the table, and I'll just pinch this up like so. Tightening this down causes it to expand in the miter slot, and that will give me pressure like so. Next, I'm going to put a hole down here. This is a little bit different type of feather board, but you can see those saw curves in there will actually allow it to spring. I'll put just a slight amount of pressure on that and clamp it like so. See just a slight amount of movement there. Put just a little more on. There. Now, when I feed this through, I'll have pressure down, I have room for my push stick, and I can control the cut safely. So let's go ahead and make this rabbet cut, and this will be one of the methods we use. Okay, so we've cut the rabbet. We got a nice clean cut, 3/8 deep, 1/2 inch this way, so we've got plenty of room for the glass and the frame material. There are a number of ways of cutting rabbets. This is one with a dado head. There's also the saw blade method, and I'm going to change this setup and then show you the saw blade method. The saw blade method requires 2 cuts, where this takes only 1. I've set up to cut the first cut in the rabbet, and I'm going to do that on edge. I've got a feather board to hold my stock, and I'll guide that in like so. I have a rip blade set for the desired height. The important thing to remember is, by starting on edge like this, what I can do is use this nice flat control surface to control the piece as I go. This will enable me to control the rip cut. Were I to use this side here, which is no longer flat and lacks a control surface, it's actually conceivably possible that I could have some kind of wedging action and not get the desired cut. So by flipping this around, I can get the cut that I need. So once I'm positioned, now the second cut has to mate up with that, and so what I'll do is I'll just loosen the feather board, bring it out of place for a minute, move this over, and bring my piece over. I can adjust the blade height by just putting it here and elevating that so that it just clears the top of the saw curve. Next, I'll position the stock here, bring the fence over, and I'm going to just eyeball that. I could draw a line on there, but I'm comfortable with this approach. Next, I'll bring the piece back so it's clear, and then I'm going to put the feather board here like so, and lock it up. So I have some feather action there to control it. Now the important thing to remember and notice here is when I complete the cut, this piece is able to fall free. It's not trapped in the feather board where it could kick back, and that's a very important thing. So as I go through, when that piece cuts off, there'll be nothing trapping it. It'll just lay there on the table. This is the cut off. The rabbet cut lines up almost perfectly. It looks like I can move the fence over just about a 30-second, and if I want to do that, one simple way to do, put your thumb against the fence, pull it back a 30-second. I could feel that, probably easier than I could measure it. Bring my stock into position one last time. Now, you notice I didn't measure when I did that. I eyeballed it, and remember, if you don't measure, you can't make measuring errors. Here's another decorative frame stock that I've made up in the past. It's something you can make quickly. There's a couple saw curve cuts here and then a couple bevels and of course the rabbets that you've already seen. I thought I'd give you a little experience with this and show you how it can be made. The first cut is the saw curve cut, and I prepared my saw so that I can make that one cut and then turn the stock around and make the second. Once that's done, we'll make the bevels. So let me set this aside. The cuts match up, and next I'm going to set up the saw for a bevel rip operation. This requires that I tilt the saw blade to a 45-degree angle, and that's going to be my next operation. I'll get that ready, and we'll be ready to make those cuts here shortly. We prepared this to make it a safe operation to make these bevel rips. We put the fence on the left side so that our stock is not trapped in a wedging action. We've raised the pop-up splitter up, and this has the anti-kickback devices so that anything that comes through there will not kick back. To actually feed the piece through with a push stick would be very difficult with the regular guard, and that's what these two pieces of particle board are about. What I've done is I put some spacers under there, the first layer, so that I can then push this over like so, and I'll get that over so that I just clear my push stick. About like that. Next I've got a spacer block and two clamps set to go here. Position that. Lightly lock that one down. Now I'll pull my setup piece out. I've got my regular piece and I'm going to make two cuts. One through and then I'll turn it around and make the other cut so that then the top will match this. So I have to remember that the curved cuts are down because the decorative face is down in this cut. So that's just about a perfect match to the original run of molding. I moved my fence over just a little closer than before, but I'm going to cut all the parts this way. They'll all be uniform and there'll be no problem with that. And again, this is the kind of creative thing you can do with any of the picture frames that you're working with. Well, I've got this blade set at a 45. I'm going to do some of the compound miter frames next. There are more bevel cuts on these than on the flat stock. And the first two cuts will be these very small ones on the inside edge. This will allow the stock to be tipped up like so in a 45. Later we'll come back and make this other bevel rip cut. Now as I flip this over, I have my reference arrow, and not surprisingly I have a reference arrow here. So I know that my arrow points away from the fence for both of these cuts. And again, that arrow that we put on when we did the coves is a good registration. And members, as you think about all these operations, it's good you leave the marks until you're done. So let's make the cuts. These will be the bevel cuts, and now that will be the orientation. So the next bevel cut will be back here. Well, the blade's still at a 45-degree angle, except I've changed the position of the fence and the feather board, and the guard is still acting as my barrier. What I'm going to be doing now is cutting this larger bevel off the edge. And again, my reference arrow, since I'm going to be cutting down here, should be toward the fence, and that's the way I have my piece. If I had a stack of them, I'd have them stacked that way so I could pull them off that pile and do it correctly. And members, that's a good tip to remember, that keep your orientation right, all your pieces facing the same way. Well, I'm ready to make the cut. we're starting to remove quite a bit of wood. I still have a fairly large control surface here and somewhat of one yet here. We'll use this against the fence to make these two inside rabbet cuts at a 45, and those will be the last two cuts at 45. So I'm going to reset the saw, and you'll see some different things as we prepare to do that. We move the fence from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, and we put our barrier over here, and our stock is going to be fed through. We're going to be making these rabbet cuts that you see here. And if you set carefully, you can actually make both of these cuts with one setup. And notice that I actually fed through and made the lower cut, and then I came back to make a little bit of the top cut. And they line up. The bottom is a perfect V, and that's good because now what's going to happen is I make one setup for two cuts. And if you're that lucky the first time, you should buy a lottery ticket. Now, we know then that the bevel will be outside like so, and as you go through, there is a tendency for this to turn. To reduce that likelihood, I have a thinner push stick which allows me to stay on the center line of the workpiece and eliminate that hazard. And members, you may want to think about setting up for a push stick of that sort so that you stay on the center line and avoid that twisting action. Well, I think I'm ready to make the cuts. You also notice we had an absence of the splitter. We can't use the splitter because it isn't a through cut, so there will be some small pieces like so. But I was careful to make sure they weren't trapped so they can't kick back. Now, all of the cuts have been made. Now it's a matter of actually making the miter cuts on the end of these pieces. So the setup again will change, and I'm going to have to first put a cross-cutting blade on so that I can do it with a quality cut. Right now it's a rip blade, and that would tear out the compound miter cut. I'll bring this miter gauge in to show you how I set my 45. This is the most accurate technique that I know of to get a good miter. I actually cut through the backing piece here, and you'll notice that it's a little longer. This will go over both sides of the guard, and that's good. This line here also tells me where the miter ought to end on any workpiece. Now, one of the cutoffs has been positioned here and clamped, and that will control length. It has a 45-degree angle. Since it's the mate of this, it will slide in like so. The most critical dimension on your frame stock is the rabbet length because this is where the glass will go. So I marked that line, but if I extend the line up here, that doesn't help me. So I took it around the back at a 45 and literally wrapped the piece. This pencil line here, though, is where the blade should exit. So if I position this like so, it should drop down into position right there where the saw blade will exit. This tells me then that everything is set correctly, and when I bring this up I can almost prove that, and I can see where the blade will cut or enter the workpiece and come across. So I'm very comfortable with this setup. Now, one other interesting thing about this stock is it still has two flats on top. And I can do this, if my miter is set very accurately, I can flip this over and cut another one because both ends have been cut at a 45. So this technique will enable me to make both long parts of this particular frame that I'm working on. Well, everything's set. I'm going to put the guard in position and then I'll make the cut. So let me get that position and we'll go from there. Now I've got to cut the two short legs for this frame and I'll be ready to glue up. So I'll cut those and we'll do some gluing then. All of the parts have been cut for this flat mitered frame, and everything's loosely positioned. I've got a clamp wrapped around here with some corner protectors on it. And this line, this nylon line, as I pull it tight, causes the spring on the other side to put some tension on the entire object. So this spring here is doing the work. Now I can align the parts just by moving them around to get the best fit that I can. And members, it's a good idea to always test the fit of the parts dry without the glue on before you do any gluing, so you're sure that the parts are going to work out well. It's really difficult if you've got glue on a part to go back and cut it again or refit it. So make sure everything works right. This looks good. I'm pleased with what I have here, and you can take a look at the corners. Everything seems to line up. There's an absence of voids or gaps, and that's what we're after. So that's ready to go. Another technique that we can use is to lay the long points of the miter tight to each other on pieces of masking tape. We can then fold those parts together and do a little of the same kind of thing in adjustment, and then if all four parts go together, we can tape the fourth corner to hold all the parts in position while the glue cures. Well, these are ready to glue. I'll get back to those in a minute, but I've got a couple other setups at the saw I'd like you to take a look at. You may remember this piece of stock and how we lost the control surface on the top. That is, it's no longer flat. For us to make the miters with a single miter gauge and flip this over, we couldn't be assured of a good miter. However, a technique that can be used if you have two miter gauges is to use a framing square to set this other miter gauge perpendicular to the first. Remember, this was 45, so this will be a complement of that, also 45. So now I can cut one miter here and then bring the piece over and cut the complementary miter here. This is an excellent technique, and members, if you're looking for an additional accessory for your table saw, an extra miter gauge can come in real handy, not only for the flat miters, but the compound miters that you're going to see in a minute. Sometimes the means to the end, the jig that you build, can be almost as much fun as the end, the picture frame. I made this up for production work, and you may find this just a nice challenge to have for accurate miter work. It's safe and it is accurate. The blade actually comes through this housing. The housing holds it together. We have a barrier guard here, so if you keep your hands clear of the opening, you'll be good and safe. Now, how does this work? How does it keep from twisting? Well, let's look at the bottom real quickly. You'll notice that there is a hardwood cleat here. This cleat is the same size as the miter slot, and it allows the piece to ride in there and control the path. So once it's positioned, it slides real nicely. Now let's take a look at cutting both parts of a frame piece. You'll also notice that the width, the maximum width I can handle here is about 2 inches. You might have to make that opening larger if you're going to work with bigger pieces, but I chose this size because typically the moldings I work with are that long. Well, we've cut both ends of the piece. We've got a nice accurate cut, and this is what you can expect from a jig like this. We can extend these lines out further if we have to control longer pieces, but most of the picture frame stock I've used with this uses smaller pieces, and this is one of the ways I use up my scrap. So think about a jig like this, design it for the picture frames or whatever it is that you're making so that the size is appropriate. Limit the width the best possible, and that'll make it as safe as it can be. When you cut a compound miter with the piece laying flat like so, there's actually 2 angles that have to be set. First, the blade is tilted to 29 degrees. Next, the miter gauge is turned to 54 3/4 degrees. I put this extension face on here to help control the stock, and I've made a cut here to help show you where the piece will go through the blade. Now, in this case, when I work with the, which would be the right miter in this case, I'm cutting over here with the good face up. To cut this miter, the mating miter, I turn the good face down and put the opposite edge against the fence. So there are actually 2 settings that have to be made, and it can be a little confusing. So what I think I'll do is make the first miter cut, show you that technique, and then move to the other side. Once again, this backing board act as a sweep and remove the scrap, and you can see the quality of the miter cut that we have here. Now, let's go to the other side. Set this off. And now we have to make the mating cut. And I have to think about this a minute. There it is, like so. Now I can set a stop here to control length, and I probably would if I were doing a large group of pieces. But let's just walk through it. Now, one of the things I like to do is kind of prove my arithmetic. In other words, say, let's put this on here and see if I got it right, and I do. Now, I like to eliminate confusion whenever possible, so once I have one correctly set, it can be a useful tool in getting the job done correctly. So let's cut the mate now. Once again, we swept the scrap out of the way, and we've got our compound miters cut. Now there's a slight burn on here, which suggests I may have let it sit on that blade a little too long. I hesitated there. I don't think it'll affect the gluing, but if it does, I may have to cut this and skin it and make the frames just a little bit smaller. Again, we have to watch our rabbet length here. That's a very important part of what we do. Well, this isn't the only way you can cut compound miters. This is a way. I want to show you another technique, and I'm going to set up a jig to do that here shortly. Earlier you saw me cut flat miters with a smaller model of the same type of jig. This configuration has been set up to do exactly the same thing, except now I can make the compound miter cut. Notice how I've got a high enough fence that I can turn my stock to a 45-degree angle and hold it in position. In fact, remember the flats I put on there, one of those is resting on the table, the other is resting on the fence, and that's the 90-degree included angle. I also have now these at 45 degrees and the blade is perpendicular to the table. So these settings are much easier than 54 3/4 degrees. I like the setup, and it moves pretty well as far as making the cuts. The other thing I like about it is I've got positive stops to control my pieces. Now this piece I cut earlier. The most important dimension of it is from here to here, because when I turn this up like so, that defines the rabbet. This is a 12 and a 1/16 inch rabbet for a 12-inch mat that will go into the frame. So this is a real good setup, and this is the stop I use to make the cut. What I thought I'd do is show you how to make the mating member to this frame, and then actually show you how all of these parts fit together. So I'm ready to cut. Let's say we do it. This is a little easier than the method you saw earlier. It's faster. I like the fact that I'm guarded, so I'm real content with this approach. Accuracy is built in, and in fact I'd like to show you that accuracy by actually showing you how the parts go together. I've got 4 of the parts laying good face down like this. The idea is when I pull this band clamp, they should lift themselves into their appropriate position. And as I pull it tight, you can see that they start to move that way. Once they're there, I can take a wrench and actually tighten up the clamp. Now let's turn it over, have a look. They seem to line up pretty well, and they'll close up nicely. So I'm real happy with that. I have actually sometimes put a little clamping pressure here to pull the miters in, and sometimes that's necessary. But if the gaps are any larger than, say, a 32nd, that suggests that your miters are off, and you may wish to recut those or check the angles that you've set on the saw to make sure everything is right. Well, this is what it takes to clamp them up. I'm going to cut the rest of the parts and get a few more frames glued up. I've cut saw kerfs in all 4 corners of this frame to use these as reinforcing splines. In other words, I'll put a piece of stock in here to reinforce the miters. This is end grain gluing, and we glued these up a while ago. They've cured and the glue is dry, but now what I want to do is put a piece in here to give me face grain gluing. In other words, a stronger joint. This will reinforce the miters and make the frame stronger. You saw me glue this one up earlier. It too set up, and I cut the curves in it. Here's one with the flat corners or flat miters, and it too has a keyway in it. One of the things you want to think about is, first, you don't want to go so deep that you cut into the decorative framework. You want to keep this cut on the outside of the frame, so don't set your blade too high. I'll show you in a minute how this actually works. We had a barrier here to make this a little safer and also support me as I went through. But let's remove this now and show you what exactly does happen. We've got actually two parts here, what I call a saddle-like device, which sits on this piece of particle board. This controls the path, and this V-like framework is a cradle that holds our stock, so I can guide it through like so. Now, in cutting these four corners, the stock must remain against this backing saddle so that the kerfs are all oriented in the same place. You don't want to kind of let it wander, but rather hold it in securely. The barrier, like I said, makes it difficult to make contact with the blade and makes the operation a little safer. So the setup is easy to make. You can make anything like this. Usually we take a piece of this same stock and use it as the center member, so they are the same size and they slide freely. You may need a little wax, but that's all it should take. Well, we've cut the keyway kerfs in here. Next we have to cut the keyway stock. I'm about to do that. I'll have to reset with a thin rip jig to do that. Here's a piece of walnut I've ripped to fit into the keyway. It fits just about perfectly. There's just a little space for the glue, and that's as it should be. We want to make this easy to fit. Now, what I'd like to do is show you the jig that I used to rip these. This L-shaped bracket is clamped to the regular fence, and it will become the fence we use. The stock will go along here like so, and as the cut is moving through the splitter, I'll pick this up and I'll complete the cut using this push block. Now, members have asked me in the past, what's the safest way to make a thin rip? And this is the safest way I know. When one moves the fence over close to the blade, you can't use the guard. This technique enables you to use the guard, and it's the safest way that I know to do it. Well, let's cut a strip and show you how that's done. We can cut strips to a uniform width all day long using this technique, and we can work safely as we do it. We've prepared this frame with the keyway stock in one corner, and this is how it would look after gluing. Then the next step would be to actually cut it close, and you can do that with a back saw or a band saw or any other tool like that. Next, you might want to shave it with a block plane or a rasp or a file, just being careful that you don't hit the flat sides of your work. Next, you can take sandpaper and actually block sand that, or use an orbital sander if you don't use too coarse of an abrasive. Once this is done, you're ready for fit and finish. Look your frame over and decide whether you're ready or not. You may need some spot work, just some sanding and so forth. Once that's done, I think you're ready to put the finish on. Now, any frame like this will be displayed with pride, and that's what most of you members want. Just work carefully on these, take your time, and that's where you'll get the best results.